Okay, we're here with Peter Rosenthal. A lawyer and a professor in mathematics. He works for social justice as a lawyer, taking on high-profile cases against the police and government. Tell us a bit about yourself, your credentials, and the type of cases you've taken on, Peter.
Yeah, I made a living throughout my life as a mathematics professor, but I'm into law from a social justice point of view. I have a very left-wing view of the world, and it got me arrested a long time ago at a demonstration that got me interested in law. So since then I've been doing legal work motivated by a desire to contribute to social change.
Okay. Do you know anything about the use of force model?
I know a lot about the use of force model.
Would you be able to explain what the use of force model is?
This is a wheel that is designed by the Ministry of Community Safety in Ontario to presumably instruct officers as to different levels of force that could be used in different circumstances. So they have the subject behavior descriptions and then appropriate force descriptions. I don't find it very useful, but they claim that officers do. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
Why would you claim it not useful?
To me it seems a complicated way of trying to describe things, but
Yeah.
that's the way it is.
Okay, what is excessive lethal force, in your opinion?
Well, excessive lethal force would mean using lethal force when it's not justified. In Ontario, for a police officer to draw his firearm, much less pull the trigger, it must be for the purpose of protecting against serious injury or death. So if there's an immediate possibility of serious injury or death, an officer is justified in drawing his or her firearm and then discharging it if necessary.
What kind of serious injury is justified to pull a firearm? Like,
it's not precisely defined, but the most standard cases that have arisen have been when somebody's threatening with a knife. And it is true that if somebody's coming at an officer or somebody else with a knife and there's an immediate threat, an officer would be justified in shooting that person if there's no other way to reasonably prevent it.
Okay. Do you feel that the majority of police in Ontario or in Canada abroad are not properly de-escalating situations with safe talk training and are turning to lethal force before using de-escalation tactics?
Yeah, that's a big issue. And there was recently an inquest into 3 deaths that concluded in Toronto. I was representing the family of Michael Elligon, a man who was shot in a hospital gown, obviously a mentally disturbed man who wasn't responding to police commands to drop the scissors that he had. Now in that situation it was clear the police did not try talking to him in any other way. What they did was they just yelled at him the standard commands for about a minute, and he didn't respond appropriately and they killed him. We had an extensive examination as to how that occurred, in spite of the fact that there have been a number of inquests that have recommended de-escalation be tried in those circumstances. Turned out that the police have a mantra, Toronto police at least, that in situations involving edged weapons, we deal with the behavior, not the condition. So they mean we deal with the fact that somebody has a knife rather than the condition, somebody being emotionally disturbed. But the fallacy there is that in dealing with the behavior, sometimes the best way to do it is to understand the condition and use that. And in particular, if somebody's not responding, if a police officer is pointing a firearm at someone and says, drop the knife, and they don't drop it, you don't need to know any more to know that they're not behaving rationally, because they're being threatened with death. If they don't drop it, then you should try some other way of reaching them. And that's been recommended by juries for years, but then they had this disconnect. If there's an edged weapon, no, it's so dangerous that we don't deal with that, we just deal with the fact of the weapon. But the inquest jury made very strong, definitive recommendations saying that even in those situations they must, if feasible, consistent with officer and public safety, try softer approaches if the yelling at them doesn't work. And if that recommendation is really put in effect, some of these killings will stop.
Indeed, I just heard the president of the Associations of Chiefs of Police. He just there was a newsletter that just came out saying that he's making new type of training that all Canadian police officers will have to take in dealing with. They'll teach you more de-escalation tactics and all that stuff. What do you think of that?
Well, I haven't read the statement, but I hope it's really specific in requiring actual de-escalation, and there should be penalties for officers who don't follow de-escalation protocols and somebody ends up getting hurt.
Do you feel that the SIU is an effective tool right now when it comes to questionable uses of force?
Well, it's more effective than having police officers investigate themselves, which was the situation prior to 1990 in Ontario. On the other hand, the SIU doesn't seem to, in many cases, probe as much as they should and charge as much as they should, in my view.
We've heard a lot of activists and protesters saying that the SIU is mainly made up of former police, which is a concern to them. And like you said, they're not charging enough people, they're not dishing out enough discipline.
Especially in Hamilton and Toronto.
Yeah.
They don't have the power to discipline. They only have, the SIU only has the power to lay criminal charges or not. So, and that, some people have suggested there could be different arrangements whereby you'd have one organization that oversees the police and is allowed to discipline them too, but that's not the situation. So the SIU just investigates whenever there's a serious injury or death caused by police officers or a sexual assault caused by a police officer, and determines whether or not to lay criminal charges. If they determine not to lay criminal charges, that ends their involvement. There could still be disciplining of the officers by the police chief, for example.
So the police chief can discipline the officers for wrongdoings?
Absolutely. For example,
Even if the chief, like say if the SIU report says that there wasn't any wrongdoings, but the chief himself feels there's wrongdoings, he could still discipline them, you're saying?
yeah, it's a different kind of wrongdoing. The SIU is charged with the question, was there a criminal wrongdoing? In other words, should criminal charges be laid? But there's a lot of wrongdoing that wouldn't necessarily be criminal, there could still be a disciplinary offense, and then that's up to the police chief to pursue.
During your lifetime, have you noticed an increase, a decrease, or a stagnation of police de-escalation tactics?
Well, in the cases that have come to the killings, there hasn't been any attempt at de-escalation. The ones that have come to inquest, there hasn't been any attempt at de-escalation, even though juries have recommended it for previous inquests. The rules should require de-escalation. If the recommendations of the recent jury were adopted, for example, saying that officers must, where feasible, attempt de-escalation, and then if that was a regulation in Ontario and an officer didn't follow that, there would be a possibility of discipline for violating it. But there aren't any regulations about it now. But there should be, in my view.
Do you feel the police are held accountable for their wrongdoings, or do you feel there is a slack in the justice system for police accountability?
It's much harder to make police accountable than it is most other people. The only cases where police seem to really get appropriately made accountable is if there's a very compelling video, and then it's very hard to argue with compelling videos. But if there's a number of witnesses against one officer, the officer seems to generally survive.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously support the idea of lapel cams on the officers?
Yes, although people should be aware it's going to cut both ways sometimes. It'll show people committing criminal offenses sometimes too. And there are privacy concerns about them too. For example, if an officer comes in your house with a lapel camera on and is in fact videoing your house, videoing you with a lover you don't want to be shown on TV with, or things like that. So there are issues about that too.
So there's the pros and cons to it, of course, yeah.
Right.
What's the worst case you have ever taken on as a lawyer? If you're
In
at
the
liberty
sense
to
of
talk.
the worst abuse?
Yeah, if you're at liberty to talk about it.
Well, several of the police killings compete for the worst. The Michael Elligan killing was among the worst, I think. And people who are interested in seeing the final moments of Michael Elligan can see it online. There's a video. The officer who shot him said he was 8 to 10 feet from him. He said Michael Elligan looked in his direction or something. In my view, it's clear that Michael Elligan is not threatening the officer in any serious way, and he killed him. There's a case that I had several years ago of a man named O'Brien Christopher Reed, who was a man with some mental health issues, not a criminal of any kind. He was walking in Edwards Gardens with a big knife in his belt, not threatening anybody. He was maybe thinking he was going to go out and cut sugar cane or something, but he was walking along not threatening anybody. Several officers were called. You can understand why people were maybe concerned because of the big knife. So several officers were called, and they came upon him. They didn't see the knife at that point. He was crouching, and then he got up when he saw them, and this is on the officer's own evidence. And the officers yelled at him, "Get down on the ground." And he said, "What for?" The officers didn't answer him. They tried to wrestle him to the ground, and they pepper sprayed him, and he ran away, and he ended up having the knife and being killed by the 3 officers. Now, in my view, that's among the worst cases because there's no excuse for the officer not to have answered his question when he said, "What for?" It was a very rational question. He hadn't done anything wrong. And the officer should have said, "Sorry, sir, we just want to talk to you a bit." But instead, they started wrestling around. When I asked the officer in cross-examination why he didn't answer the question, he said, "First we get control, then we answer the questions," which is the wrong way around, in my view. They have to realize that talking and answering questions and giving explanations and so on could be the best way of getting control. So that's
Exactly.
among the most horrible cases, I think. This poor young man just says, "What for?" and they don't even answer the question.
Mm-hmm. Like, what do you think is what do you think is wrong with the police training today when it comes to de-escalating situations and use of force? What do you think is wrong with it?
Well, in Toronto, it seems that the officers are taught if there's edged weapons involved, it's so dangerous that you don't think about de-escalation. But the inquest jury at the recent inquest made very strong recommendations that they must consider de-escalation in those circumstances too, as long as it can be done safely. And so if that becomes a regulation and is really enforced, I think that'll stop many of these killings. Of course, there's always going to be an occasional case where no matter how you try to de-escalate, it's not going to work.
Yeah, like there is legitimate times where use of force lethal force has to be applied, of course.
But it should be a last resort and should be avoided if possible. There's a very interesting video available on YouTube of something that happened in Britain a couple of years ago. There was a big guy, very upset, with a big machete, threatening officers, and officers come near him, and he runs after them actually with it. And then another officer comes up and hits him from behind with a baton, and he turns and starts running after that guy. That guy would have been shot 100 times in Toronto. They didn't shoot him at all, and they gradually got more and more officers around him, and they used shields to deflect the machete, and they disarmed him with nobody hurt.
Impressive.
Very impressive.
There's actually a story in Hamilton that you know of with that guy.
Yeah, it never made the mainstream, but some guy was walking around with a samurai sword, and he was actually gonna go at my buddy, and some courageous officer came out of nowhere and just tackled the guy. No pepper spray, no taser, no gun, just boom.
Right.
But I mean, that a samurai sword's a legitimate reason to draw your firearm, right? Especially buddies waving it around. But this officer definitely had some courage and took him out, so that was pretty cool.
Right. No, that's good. There are certainly some officers who do a good job.
Yeah. During the G20 here in Toronto, it said that people's constitutional rights were infringed upon. Can you describe to us and the listeners what types of rights were infringed upon by the police?
Well, during the G20, the right to protest was very severely curtailed by the police. First off, there was a general situation where they kept protesters blocks away from the actual G20 meeting. So none of the world leaders could hear a whisper from even if 20,000 people were chanting.
Mm-hmm.
And that already, right at the beginning, in my view, interfered with the right to protest. I mean, people have a right to be heard a little bit, at least. But then also they arrested a number of people in various situations by the hundreds where there was no grounds to do it. They detained people, they wouldn't let people go, Queen and Spadina and so on. There were a number of situations. So there were many mass detentions that were totally unlawful.
Mm-hmm.
And then they did a lot of assaulting of individual people too. So there's a lot of problems.
I was here for that weekend, witnessed it firsthand. It was insanity. We see like the protesters turn violent. When you see protesters turning violent, do you feel that really hurts people who want to protest? Just because it gives the police that excuse to do the mass rollouts and the mass arrests?
Yeah, my personal view is that there was no reason for protesters to be violent at all during the G20. On the other hand, what I say when people ask me that, and if you run that, you got to run this too, is the violence that they did, smashing windows and something like that, pales in comparison with the violence that they were opposing with the G20 of killing thousands of people and starving and impoverishing people around the world and so on. So there wasn't any justification for it, and it wasn't helpful in my view, the protest of violence, but it's trivial compared to the violence inflicted by the leaders of the G20.
Couldn't agree more.
What are some, this is my last question, what are some solutions, to police brutality and police accountability? I know you did mention some earlier, but I mean, to end it off, what are some solutions to police brutality and to hold police accountable for their wrongdoings?
Well, in my view, there have to be more regulations with respect to police activity, including requiring them to try de-escalation, verbal de-escalation in situations where that's consistent with safety before they use any serious amount of force. And there has to be enforcement of those regulations. That's, in my view, the prime way that things could be improved. If they followed the teachings that you can speak more softly to people if commands don't work, and you can use people's names and try and reach them, instead of saying, just screaming at a person when there's no response to it, drop it or I'll shoot. You say, excuse me, Michael, they even knew his name. Nobody tried using it. You say, Michael, what's the problem?
Mm-hmm.
Michael, can we help you in some way? Maybe he wouldn't have responded, but maybe he would have.
Yeah.
And there's no reason not to try that in a situation like that, and inquest juries have recommended that kind of thing over and over. But it has to be really enforced that they must try it if it's consistent with safety.
Yeah, for sure. Like even with Sammy Yatim, he was acting irrational, but they could have at least been like, hey, what's your problem? Why are you doing this? Can we help you?
Yeah, it would have been relatively easy for them because he was shouting at them. Now, he was shouting curse words and stuff at them, but still, if somebody's talking, that's a way of beginning a conversation. If he's shouting nasty things at the police can say, well, what's the problem? What did we do wrong? Or how can we help you? What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
We'd really like to help you. And so it's an opportunity. They didn't take the opportunity, they just killed them.
Mm-hmm.
So in essence, it boils down to training on the officers.
Right.
Training and enforcement of
enforcing the
Training and enforcement of the training, yeah.